Only one Toronto newscast can prepare you for the future. Hillary Brown and the CBC at 6. News for the 90s.
You think about dying?
No.
Not afraid?
No.
Not afraid of the chair?
No.
How come?
Because I'm peaceful with myself.
Dalton Prejean has the mental age of 13 and is brain injured. On May 18th at 2 a.m., he will die in the Louisiana State Penitentiary because he killed a police officer. His only hope? A call from the state governor. Hello and welcome to another edition of DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit.
Dalton Prejean is said to have the mental age of 13. He is borderline mentally handicapped. As well, he has significant brain damage. He is the father of a 9-year-old son conceived and born during Prejean's long stay on death row. Extensive U.S. and world media coverage of Prejean included this report by CBS correspondent Mike Wallace.
Dalton Prejean is now 29. When he was 14, he shot and killed a taxi driver and was sent to a reform school. When he was 17, he shot and killed Louisiana State Trooper Donald Cleveland, who was frisking his brother after a traffic violation, and he was sentenced to death. He has lived here on death row at the state pen in Angola, Louisiana for 10 years, and shortly after midnight on Wednesday, he is scheduled to die here in the electric chair. You think about dying?
No.
Not afraid?
No.
Not afraid of the chair?
No.
How come?
Because I'm peaceful with myself.
Honest?
Honest.
My little brother was raised in a big city. He was raised with a woman that's abusive, and I think he was an abused child. I mean, he also was, he's something is very wrong with him mentally, you know. Something is wrong with him mentally.
And those mental problems, says Dr. David Baer, caused Prejean to act violently.
Because of Dalton Prejean's brain damage, specifically his frontal lobe damage, he did not have the ability to reflect or consider alternatives. He did not have effective control.
So when he believed his brother was being menaced by a state trooper, he acted impulsively. He shot him 5 times.
But a humane society looks to the causes, the reasons why things occur. In my view, a humane society would not put Dalton Prejean to death.
And his attorneys say Prejean was sent to death row by an all-white jury that didn't hear any of this.
It would be, in my mind, an extraordinary injustice if Dalton Prejean were executed without there first being a jury that sat on sentencing that heard all of the evidence.
But almost overlooked in the 11th hour efforts to spare Dalton Prejean's life are the lives of Candace Cleveland and her children. After all, Trooper Donald Cleveland wasn't the only victim of Prejean's violence.
Why should he live to shoot someone and hear that person holler in pain and then for Donald to fall in a ditch and literally he bled to death?
Tough question, honest answer. Could you go in there and pull the switch on Wednesday night?
Yes.
You couldn't. But before that switch is pulled, Dalton Prejean and his defenders hope this phone will ring with news that the governor of Louisiana has called off the execution. You think the proper punishment for Dalton Prejean would be what?
I would like to live with my mistake.
Live in prison?
Yeah.
Rest of your life?
Rest of my life.
Mike Wallace, CBS News, Angola, Louisiana.
Prejean did not go to the chair after the Wallace interview. He got a stay of execution. But now the Supreme Court has ruled that it is not cruel and unusual punishment to execute brain-damaged juveniles. Now Prejean's life is in the hands of Governor Romer. Earlier, Joe spoke with one of Prejean's attorneys, John H. Hall.
Mr. Hall, what are the chances of the governor of Louisiana stopping the execution?
Well, I think they're moderate. We are hopeful that we have developed some new information for the governor, both on the medical, psychological front and with respect to juror attitudes. The particular jurors in this case towards the desirability or non-desirability, we hope, of an execution. The governor has, however, painted himself into a corner by making a statement voluntarily, without any inspiration from us certainly, that he is disinclined to grant any further stays or to grant clemency. But we do hope to meet with him, and we do hope to make a good, solid presentation.
What steps are you taking at this late hour to prevent the execution?
Well, we're working on two fronts simultaneously. First, we are focusing on developing a further court challenge, and the focus of that challenge is to develop that Dalton failed to get adequate psychological screening at the time of his initial trial. He was examined by a psychologist on a very limited basis. We have had the tests that were initially done redone and rescreened, and have discovered, actually just before I arrived here today, that the tests indicate profound brain damage that could have been screened and discovered at the time of the initial examination back in 1978. Excuse me, back in 1982. That being the case, we think we have a strong legal argument to present to the court, and we will be doing that. This same evidence will be presented to the governor in an effort to get him to exercise his clemency powers. That will be coupled with a campaign facilitated by others who are opposed to capital punishment, or opposed in general or in this specific case, based either upon the mental disability, brain damage issues, or upon the fact that we have a black man who was convicted by an all-white jury for the homicide of a white person, and those several issues bring together many different groups, both down in Louisiana and around the world, and we hope that pressure on the governor will have some effect and open his mind to the issues that we have.
Mr. Hall, thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
Our producer, John Cass, has been working on this story and was able to reach Dalton Prejean by telephone. It will probably be the last interview with him before the execution date. John, what was it like to interview a man who's going to be executed in the next couple of weeks?
Well, Susan, an interview with Dalton is a very extraordinary experience. He's a very eloquent man in his own way, and he's very at peace with himself and his situation. Dalton has lived life one day at a time pretty well, and that's the way he's going about it now. He's been through this before. It's not his first day of execution, and I know everyone with his case is hoping that the appeal to the governor for clemency will be successful. For my first question to Dalton, I asked him if he was optimistic about the future.
Yes, you have to think about it, face up to reality, what it is, So like I said, I'm trying to look at the best possibility there can be, If it does happen, I can't do anything about it, It's a shame that I have to hang in the balance with another man holding my life in his hands.
Does your son know what could happen to you?
Yes, I believe he's very aware of what's happening, Like I said, he's a smart kid, A lot of people don't give kids credit they're due.
Why do you think the governor should commute your sentence?
Like I said, I have changed, I'm not the same person I was back then. Plus, it's not like everybody would believe it to be, because it was just a traffic ticket that Super Cleveland life was took. It wasn't that at all, but more or less a provoke situation. I don't see how capital punishment is going to solve anything. It's not going to bring Mr. Cleveland back.
How have you changed?
Because I've learned to be patient and think about other people, not just myself. God has given me a better eyesight on life itself, as understanding, and try to be the better person that I can be.
You told Mike Wallace that you were not afraid to die. Do you still feel that way?
Yes.
Joining me now is Orville Endicott. He's a lawyer with the Canadian Association for Community Living, an organization that advocates for people with developmental disabilities. Mr. Prejean doesn't look mentally disabled. He's articulate. He seems to be in full possession of his faculties. Does that have a reflection on this situation?
Well, first of all, I don't think that it's fair to say that there is a typical appearance or even sound of a person that you would say that person has a mental handicap. Everybody's different, and certainly he's himself. Now, he may not have appeared to the jurors, for example, as someone with a disability. It could very well be that he has an impairment that is not obvious, that affects things like how he's able to control himself in very difficult situations, rather than how he presents himself in ordinary situations.
Mr. Endicott, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
If you'd like to make your views known to Governor Romer, you can reach him by writing to the Honorable Charles Romer, Governor of Louisiana, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 70804 USA. Or you can call him at area code 504-342-7015 or 342-6600. We'll give you these numbers again at the end of the show.
There are 2.5 million people across Canada who experience some degree of hearing loss. Deafness is a disability which can drastically affect the ability to communicate. And yet, as the following report shows, people who are deaf have been very effective at organizing and getting their point of view across in the media. The most recent example of this occurred in Toronto a few days ago. The CBC reporter is Noel Richardson.
The chants were all done by hand, so the protesters used a drum to make themselves heard. Almost 200 people showed up at Queen's Park today to demand better education for the deaf. They want the government to pass Bill 112 that would give deaf students the right to use American Sign Language in school.
We're talking about American Sign Language, which includes its own grammar. It's a very conceptual language, an equivalent language to English. This signed English is actually a code system for English. It's not a language. And so you have to memorize the codes to be able to decipher what's being said.
Today's demonstrators also want to see more deaf teachers in the classroom.
We also have to look at the fact that deaf teachers have still not been hired. Ontario statistics continue to show a very low percentage of deaf teachers compared to other stats across Canada.
Those statistics show that of 129 teachers for the deaf, only 9 of them are deaf. Today's demonstrations took place in a number of cities across the province. The government seems reluctant to say when or if Bill 112 will become law. It received unanimous support in the House on its second reading and is now in front of a committee for further discussion. But the Ontario Association of the Deaf fears that with a possible election this fall, Bill 112 will die before it becomes law. Noel Richardson, CBC News, Toronto.
Joining me now is Dennis Morris. He's the Executive Director of the Canadian Hearing Society. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Susan.
As we saw from that video, the deaf seem to be a very powerful lobby group and very effective in getting their message across. Why?
It's taken them 100 years, Susan, and we're just so pleased to see it happen. Is that deaf people have been left out of the decision-making process and everything that's affected their lives for so many years. And finally, they're having a say in what is happening to them. And they're organized through sign language interpreters, they're able to communicate, and they're wanting a say in terms of how they are educated. And that's what Bill 112 is about, and that's what deaf people all over North America are fighting for. What they're saying is that deaf people use sign language as their basic means of communication. And they're saying that's the language we want to have as an option, as a language of instruction in schools for the deaf right across North America. So that's the kind of thing that they're fighting for.
And this is happening right across Canada?
Across Canada, across North America. In fact, the first deaf president of Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. was elected, and he was the first deaf president.
They appear to be effective in their lobbying, but what have they achieved? What are they accomplishing?
Well, they had deaf education reviewed for the first time in Ontario, and that took a private member's bill, and there are very few private members' bill that go through. And same with Bill 112, they are lobbying for that as, again, as the language of instruction for deaf people. So clearly they are being effective. And it is happening last week with all these rallies. Those rallies were happening right across Canada.
Now, what can other disability groups learn from the deaf?
Perseverance, Susan, and good communication, and not to quit.
Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
Across Canada, people with disabilities continually fight for the right to ride buses and subway cars like everyone else. This week, the disability community appeared to suffer a serious setback. The issue is the Toronto Transit System's soon-to-be expanded subway service. Susan has the story.
The Premier promised
Transaction is a consumer-based coalition that wants full access to all forms of transportation, not just for people with disabilities, but for senior citizens, parents with children, and others who have trouble managing steps and escalators. The coalition called this press conference to protest a proposed amendment to the Ontario Building Code that would allow new subways to be built without elevators. In other words, the new stations would not be accessible for people with mobility impairments. The coalition accused David Peterson's Liberal government of breaking its promise to make the transportation system accessible. One of the group's spokespersons was Anne Musgrave.
Transaction is really appalled and bewildered to learn of the provincial government's planned amendment to the Ontario Building Code. It's especially shocking, emerging as it does from a government whose record includes the proclamation of the Decade of the Disabled, as well as legislation, policies, and programs aimed at improving integration and participation for disabled persons. We can't help wondering if the government is signaling its unwillingness to implement the key recommendations contained in the TTC report, Choices for the Future, and passed by Metro Council unanimously on March 28th of this year. The planned amendments are discriminatory, in our view, and fly in the face of our Human Rights Code. Besides this, the amendments are a backward step. They reflect an era about 40 years ago when persons with disabilities were confined to institutions or their homes. The mean age of the population was much younger, and men were the main commuters, while women and very young children stayed at home. These are the 1990s we live in right now. Recent systems have made themselves accessible to all persons, and it's unthinkable that in the 1990s anybody would plan a system, in my view, that would be anything else but fully accessible.
Housing Minister John Sweeney, the man responsible for the building code, further inflamed disability rights activists by saying the plan would actually protect people in wheelchairs. He said they would not be able to get to the surface quickly if a train had to stop between stations. By keeping them out of the subway, he said they would actually be safer.
We know we can't reduce it all, but let's, in all fairness, to everybody that has to use those stations and those trains, that we reduce the risk to the best possibility that we can.
At the Transaction News Conference, Anne Musgrave responded to Sweeney's statement.
Every time we step out our door, we take a risk that something's going to hit us or hurt us. We're going to fall down the stairs, we're going to get hurt in some way in the course of our day. And we take a lot of risks in order to live and be integrated and be involved in our communities. And disabled people also have this right to be involved and to take some moderate risks in order to be involved in the community. And it's overprotective, in a sense, to worry about that. I mean, people live on the 25th floor of buildings, even though they know that if there's a fire, they may not get out. And so I guess what we would like is that the standards that are applied to everyone else in terms of subways and in terms of buildings are also used for disabled people. They have a right to take chances.
Transaction will take its concerns directly to Housing Minister John Sweeney on Wednesday, May 16th. Do you feel you need to be protected on the subway, Joe?
I find it rather interesting that people in Toronto have to be protected, whereas in San Francisco and the Oakland area, on the BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit System, which is fully accessible, you see disabled people using that particular subway all the time without getting injured or hurt. It's quite appalling, quite amazing.
A little bit of an insult.
Certainly. Now, let's take a quick look at some of the letters that have come into our office. Many viewers are happy with what we are doing, others are not. First, Harry Randall of Toronto. He enjoys the show, but he didn't like what John Owen, head of CBC Television News, had to say. If you recall, Owen was on the show with former Toronto Sun editor Peter Worthington.
Mr. Owen suggested that disabled engage in lobbying and demonstrations in the same manner as other interest groups. Obviously, he does not realize these activities take a lot of time to organize. There are special considerations when the disabled are involved, such as transportation, accessibility, possibly accommodation, and perhaps even medical supervision.
And here's part of a letter from Helmut Buxbaum, who is serving a life sentence for murder.
Having spent 20 years in the nursing home business, I could not help notice the woeful situation handicapped prisoners find themselves in. Since the penitentiaries were built in the Kingston area, millions of dollars have been spent in renovations, but with a total disregard for the handicapped prisoner. Could you do a documentary on handicapped prisoners in Canada? Thanks for your broadcasts. They are very good.
John Ray of Toronto is mad at us because we aired a CBC report from Vancouver in which the reporter talked about the terrors of blindness.
How did that offensive comment get through? Don't you look at content before it goes on air? I thought the Disability Network was going to be a model that the rest of the journalistic public should emulate.
Another viewer who was upset by something she saw in the program is Karen Miller of Toronto. Miller did not like me telling a friend, half in jest, that I would never stop picking on the able-bodied.
I feel you are more and more recently promoting a form of reverse discrimination that is harmful to everyone. Your program could be a great tool for public education and understanding and the betterment of life for many people. It could also become nothing but a forum for the embittered.
Chris of Ottawa, we can't make out his last name, says the tone of the DNet is too militant, too inflammatory.
I have to question whether your male host is appropriate, not because he isn't successful or intelligent enough, but because the chip on his shoulder is not what we would instill in the hearts and minds of anyone, let alone the disabled. You catch more flies with honey.
Closed captioning is a concern of our next viewer, Susan Smith.
I don't know if your show is caption-coded. You talk about hearing impairment, but the hearing impaired cannot watch independently if you are not caption-coded.
Well, Miss Smith, this is as good a time as any to apologize for the fact that not all programs to date have been closed captioned because of technical glitches. One that wasn't was last week's special on Meech Lake. We invite viewers who couldn't follow the program to send us a self-addressed, stamped envelope, and we'll send you out a full transcript of the program. Again, our apologies.
Please keep those letters coming. Our address is the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. Our fax number is 416-975-5636.
Once again, here's the address of the Governor of Louisiana. Charles Romer, Governor of Louisiana, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 70804, USA. His phone number is area code 504-342-7015 or 342-6600. His fax number is 342-0909.
And that's our show for this week. Goodbye, Joe.
Goodbye, Susan.
He's a fellow with a marvelous human spark and personal magnetism that, in spite of the extreme difficulty of his current circumstances, as he focuses on May 18th, that's ever closer to us, that spark is still very much there, and for those of us who have had the privilege to work with him, you still feel a very positive life force at work.
When the clock strikes 11, only one newscast can give you the real picture. Ona Fletcher, weeknights on the CBC at 11, News for the 90s.